How do you go about planning a spring garden? Today I'm going to take you through the process that I go through planning my garden for springtime. G'day there, I'm Dana from Pewakaka Valley Homestead. Today the kids are out and the baby's in bed, so I thought I'd spend some time by the fire and plan out my spring garden. Planning out a garden is a really good way of making sure you're getting the absolute most out of the space that you have got. And with the way the world is at the moment and food chain uncertainty and all that sort of jazz, we have really stepped up how much we plan on growing this year. We've actually added an extra 5 garden beds, which I have shown you on previous videos. And in those we're going to be growing some of the more high calorie sort of staple crops that previously I haven't bothered really attributing too much bed space to. So there is a real technique to getting the most out of the garden space that you do have, and putting together a springtime gardening plan is really the first step to making sure that you're going to be getting the most food out of the smallest amount of land space, and also that you don't run out of seeds or seedlings, that you've always got some ready to go. Planning your garden can vary quite significantly, from really sitting down and working out maturity dates and when to sow stuff. And I have previously in the past, I'll show you, this was last year's plan where I gave it a really good go just to see just how much we could get out of the garden. So this one here, I have got each of the different colours is like first crop, second crop, and tarping it. I've got all the different types, I've got the dates. And when we should be planting and harvesting all the different types of plants there. And from that I used that to work out a monthly planting plan. So for October I've got, sow this many seeds, plant out, transplant these ones, harvest these ones. And it's all well and good, but the reality is plants grow faster in the middle of the season, which is what all these dates are based on, and they grow slower on the colder shoulder seasons. And actually last year we had a really long cold spring that lasted for half the summer, and the summer was really short, and then the weather kind of got cold again. So while best laid plans and all that, it was a great idea, and it was really good to be able to follow through and each month go, right, this month I need to be planting, sowing these things. But what I was finding was that harvest wasn't coming in when I was expecting it to come in, which meant that instead of getting three rotations through most of my garden beds, and sometimes 4, which is what I'd hoped and planned for, what I actually ended up getting was 1 or 2 rotations through. And that was really good learning to be able to work out exactly what our garden is capable of in a colder season. So this year my plan is a little less strict and a little more fluid, where what I've been doing is just writing the month at the top and then the ones that I'm hoping to get in the ground. So this makes sure that I've got them all ready ahead of time, but I'm not being so fastidious about getting too many rotations through and getting frustrated with it. One of the key numbers that I used for all of that big intense planning was some data that I found. Some of it was online, some of it was in a book, and some of it was from the website that I actually bought the seeds from. And so I used how many days things take to germinate, and then how many days things take from transplant to maturity. And I added those up, and they were the date numbers that I used. But what I failed to add into those calculations was just how much longer things take to grow in the colder weather. So you could find that maybe radishes in the middle of summer might be, from sowing to harvesting, might take 28 days. But in the springtime and autumn and the coldest shoulder seasons, you may find that they take at least half that time again, sometimes even twice as long. So that's why when you find that you plant stuff out early springtime and then sort of late springtime you put some more in, and they all come ready at the same time, and that's what's happening there, is the colder weather is making them grow slower. So if you're planning on putting together a garden plan for this year, maybe it's your first go at putting together a vegetable garden, maybe this year you really want to make sure you're getting the most out of your vegetable garden. Today I'm going to go through some resources that I've got that can help you achieve this, and also we'll go through a bit of a strategy for you. One of the very first things you'll need to do when you're planning your garden is to get yourself a decent map of what you've got to work with. So you need to get out there with a tape measure, get some measurements, work out where your garden beds actually are, how big they are, how wide they are, and this will give you an idea more of how many plants you can put in, and also whether maybe you might want to be expanding that garden some. I like to plan mine on square paper, you know, the stuff that the kids use for their maths books at school, the ones with the little squares on it, and I find that really helpful for planning the garden out. It makes it much easier. You work out that a square equals whatever unit of measurement you want it to work out to be. Maybe if they're tiny squares, they might be a foot or half a metre or something. Just work out what works for you, and then draw a 2-scale plan of your actual garden. And then the next thing you want to work out is where the sun goes and where the predominant wind goes, because they will determine which beds are better for planting which plants in. Some plants, like your tomatoes, don't do so well with the wind, but they really like the sun. So those sorts of things, things like lettuce don't appreciate the really hot driving sun of the summer. So maybe if some of your garden beds get a bit of shade over them, they might be perfect for the lettuce to be in. Now I actually have a really helpful resource that you might like to look into. It's a book that I have written called The Homesteaders Guide to Seasonal Gardening, and it actually has all of this information in it, as well as planting lists for every month, depending on what zone you're in, and it has information on harvesting and storing and even cooking the food that you get out of your garden. It really is sort of the go-to guide for anyone wanting to raise their own vegetables in their garden. So I will put a link to that down below, and recommend that you have a look at that. One of the next things you will need to know is when your frost dates are. Your frost dates are when your first frost and your last frost are expected for the year. So there are different places you can find that out. If you're in New Zealand, I actually have a link on my website that will tell you your first and last frost dates. Otherwise, if you're America or Canada, the Farmer's Almanac website has all that information on there. But usually if you just type in Google and your where you are and first frost date, last frost date, Google's magic enough these days to be able to usually pull something up for you. The reason you want to know your frost dates is for all your frost tender vegetables. So you're looking at your tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, capsicums, courgette, zucchinis, pumpkins, all those squash families, all those ones that if they got a frost they would die. You want to know when your last frost date is, because you can start those vegetables in seed trays inside somewhere sheltered 4 to 6 weeks before that last frost date, so that you've got them nice and big and strong and ready to plant out after the last frost. And also on the other end of that, knowing when your first frost is, that's when you can plan the end of your harvest to be. So you wouldn't... So for example, if your tomatoes, I've just got a variety that I'm really excited about called Subarctic Plenty, which will put out tomatoes 60 days from transplant. So 60 days plus the 4 weeks in a tray, say 90 days. If I have 90 days from the end of, if I have 90 days from my very first frost date, expected frost date, and count back 90 days, I can still be starting seeds then and know that I'm going to be getting a harvest before that first frost comes to kill them off. More cold hardy plants can actually be started even sooner. So our last frost date here, we're quite coastal, we're in the bottom of New Zealand. Our last frost date here is usually around the 10th of September. But in Dunedin, which is the city nearest to where we are, the traditional day to actually start planting up your garden is sort of mid to late October, or Labour weekend is our holiday. But there is some frost hardy stuff that I can actually get started, which I will be starting in the next couple of weeks, that I can get in the ground even before our frosts have actually finished happening. So there are things like brassicas and peas, broad beans or fava beans is their other name. Those sorts of things, onions, those sorts of things you can get started soon and get them into the ground even before the frosts have really gone away. I also have another really good resource that I have put together for you, which is a succession planting spreadsheet, which will give you, the, if you put in your first frost date and your last frost date, it will give you all the seed sowing dates that you can put in for your different plants. So it's a really helpful resource. It's so useful. I'm actually going to do a whole nother video on it, and I'll put a link to that down below once it's out. Otherwise, you can sign up to my email list, and I'll put a link to that down below as well, and you can sign up there and it will give you the link that you need to access this spreadsheet yourself. How much food you want to grow of your own, and whether you want to focus on the long-term storage crops that you can usually pick up really cheaply from bulk food stores or even from the supermarket. Things like your dried beans, potatoes, onions, all those sorts of more staple crops that tend to take up quite a lot of room. So you need to decide whether you have enough space to be able to do that, whether you want to expand your garden, or whether you just want to buy those things in. That's entirely up to you, but it's something you do need to think about. You might just want to keep your backyard space for those more boutique specialty crops that your family enjoy eating, like your fresh salad greens, maybe baby radishes, fresh carrots, those sorts of things. And then you need to decide what varieties you're going to be growing. There's heirloom varieties. These tend to be ones that you'll get by seed. They're older varieties. They tend to have a lot more variety of a lot bigger range of colours and textures and types that you can get. But some of them can be lower producers and some of them can be a little more subject to disease. The other option is the F1 hybrids, and these tend to be higher producers and more disease resistant, but you are limited quite substantially down to the strains that they have available. Also, heirloom and open pollinated plants you can keep your own seeds from, whereas the F1 types you can't keep the seeds from. They just won't grow true to type. In fact, some of them are completely sterile. Of course, you're not limited to one, you can do both. And then you need to also decide whether you want to be doing seeds or seedlings, because they have merits and benefits as well. But again, you can do both. You can buy in seedlings from a store to get your garden off to a good start, and then you can sow your seeds for your subsequent plantings. It's entirely up to you which way you want to work this. One of the biggest problems with growing, especially if you're wanting a self-sufficient garden, is knowing exactly how many plants to grow for each person that you've got of each of the different varieties. So I have actually put together a PDF for you, which I can show you now. And this PDF, it has all the different types of common vegetables and how many plants per person that you will want to be growing and sowing. Once you know how much space these plants actually take up, then you can start planning how big your garden needs to be and which ones you can fit in where. Another key consideration, of course, is whether the plants that you're trying to grow actually can grow in your zone. So I have this PDF here, which you can access from my website. I'll put a link to that as well down below, and it will tell you what plants grow in each of the different zones. It makes more sense to try and grow the things that will grow well where you are. And you may consider using a tunnel house or a cold frame, or even some of those small low tunnels that you can, put either a piece of wire or a piece of pipe, something over, and then put some plastic over the top of that. And that can help extend the length of your season and warm up your summers as well. So there are some ways that, even if it's not on your official list that you can grow in your area, that you can add some heat and some extra growing time to be able to grow some of the stuff that doesn't usually grow in your place. Crop rotation is another thing you might like to take into consideration. I've watched quite a lot of Charles Dowding's YouTube videos, and he's running an experiment. I think it's been running for 5 or 6 years now, of growing the same vegetables in the exact same place to see if crop rotation really is a thing. And honestly, he has found no difference between the ones that he rotates around and the ones that are growing in the exact same place year after year. However, I can see some merit to doing crop rotations. The biggest one being you can alternate how much manure and how much extra compost and how much you're feeding the soil by rotating around what plants you're growing. For example, in one bed you might want to grow your heavy feeders. So in this bed you would add plenty of well-rotted manure, lots of compost, plenty of food for the plants. And in there you can grow things like potatoes, yams, capsicums, chilies, tomatoes, cucumbers, pumpkins, all those really heavy feeders. And then the next year in that same garden bed, you can just add a little bit of compost or a little bit of manure and grow some of the lighter feeding legumes, which will then also help fix extra nitrogen into the soil themselves. So they're your peas and your beans, those sorts of things. And then the following year in that same garden bed, you've already got the light dusting of compost from the year before. You've already got some extra fixed nitrogen, so you can give it just a little dusting again of some more compost and grow in there your brassicas and your leafy greens. Those sorts of things are generally considered sort of heavy-ish feeders, but not as heavy as like your tomatoes and capsicums, those sorts of things. And your greens will do really, really well in that nitrogen-rich soil that's been left behind from your peas and beans. And then the following year, you don't need to add any extra compost or manure. All that extra goodness from the years before is still sitting in the ground, but it's not too fresh and not too high in nitrogen, so it is perfect for growing your root crops like your carrots, onions, beetroots, those sorts of things that don't need all that extra nutrients. So in that way, crop rotation can be really helpful, to be feeding up the garden bed heavily, but not all of the garden beds really heavily every year. It's making the most of what resources you do have. Speaking of making use of resources you do have, if you have garden walls or you have places that you can be growing things vertically, by all means do it. It's a great way of getting more out of your space. Pumpkins, most of your squashes, peas and beans, all of those will grow really happily up a frame and leave you quite a bit more space on the ground. So if you can at all grow vertically, if you have somewhere that you can hang planters, you can be putting extra crops of things like strawberries, those sorts of things that will grow really well in containers. Lettuce, those cut and come again salad greens do really well in containers as well, as long as you can keep them watered so they don't go bitter and yuck. So that's a really good way of using some of that vertical space and getting more out of the garden that you do already have. Another thing that is often really missed when it comes to gardening, a lot of people will plant their garden once and then that's it for the year. And we forget that you can usually, depending where you live obviously, but you can pretty much always get at least a fall garden in, or an autumn garden, if not also a winter garden. So planning for those winter, colder weather crops with plenty of time. So often some of them will take 6 months really to get going, because you're growing them through that colder shoulder season as well. So I usually find that I start my winter stuff often sort of around Christmas time actually, which for us is nearer the end of the first month of summer. So that's when I start my celery and my leeks, a lot of my brassicas that are for the colder weather. I start all of those sort of around then, with plans to put them in the ground in autumn so that they can grow through the winter. So once you have an idea of what plants you want to grow, what varieties you want to grow of those types of plants, how much you want to grow of each plant, how much space you have to plan in, what dates you've got to work around, and whether you've got any extra space that you can be using as well, now's the time to actually just sit down with a pen and paper and plan out your garden. It's a really good idea for each, write down all your varieties that you're going to be growing and how many of each of those plants you'll be wanting. Always, 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 if you're starting from seed, sow more than you think you're going to need, because the slugs will get some will die for whatever reason, and it's always best to have more. And if you don't need more, give them away. Seeds cost barely anything really, so it's well worth growing some more than what you think you need. So once you've got what types you're going to grow, work out how many days are expected from sowing to germination, and then how many days from the plant to harvest. Add those up and try and sit down with a calendar and work your way back and work out when roughly you want to be starting to get those things planted. And don't forget to add in your succession plantings as well. And that's when I find it really helpful to write down each month. I don't go week by week because life is too busy to go week by week. I know that if things are within the month, then I'm going to be all right with harvesting at the other end. A couple of weeks here or there isn't going to make a big difference to harvesting at the other end. So as long as each month has a list of the seeds I want to get in the ground and the transplants that I want to be getting in the ground, and often I'll write in which ones I need to be hardening off for the following month as well. So hardening off is just the process of taking your new transplants from the nice sheltered place that you have been growing them and putting them outside to expose them to the elements. So you start by doing that sort of for an hour or two a day, and just slowly increase it until they're ready to be out there for the whole night, and that's when it's a good time to get them transplanted. We have plans to get quite a few of our brassicas started soon. It's actually still the middle of winter here, and I'm going to take you out and quickly show you the seed raising house that I have put together for getting some seeds started. Because previously we've started them in our tunnel house, but this year I've got salad greens all over the floor of the tunnel house growing, which we're enjoying eating, but it means that I don't have the space to be growing all my transplants and stuff on the ground. Usually I cover half the tunnel house floor on with all my seedlings, because I often will grow them for my sisters and my parents as well. So I just won't have the space in there this year, so this is my seed raising house that I have put together. Now I had thought of covering this with some hard plastic, but unfortunately the hard plastic is really quite expensive and still quite brittle in the wind. So this is just cheap plastic polythene. I've double layered it on the outside. And before anyone asks, no, I don't have plans for this. I have literally just made it up as I go along. And these doors are 2x1s that have just got this plastic sandwiched in between them. And in here I've got 2 levels of shelves. These are about 2 foot deep, which is pretty much perfect for my big flats that I can put in there with a wee bit of wiggle room as well. And on the back is just a piece of plywood to cover it in, give it a wee bit of warmth. And the reason I've put it here is because it faces north, and we have a tap just nearby as well for watering. It'll get a lot of sun here, but it will also lose the sun as it gets round for the sort of the later bit of this day where it gets hot, because I'm trying not to cook the plants at the same time. So this will be where I start all my spring seeds, and in the middle of summer I'll probably also start seeds in here, but leave the doors open to let the heat out. I hope you found this planning video really helpful. If you have, like the video, consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you videos twice a week on growing and preserving your own food. We'll see you in the next one.